Good morning. I'm very pleased to be with you. My name is Frédéric Fauvet. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education Technology at Royal Roads University on the west coast of Canada in Victoria. I'm delighted to be part of this session organized by the Bahrain Teachers College, and also delighted to be part of the publication effort on the volume Educational Leadership and Continuous Teachers Professional Development. So I hope this will emerge from this brainstorming and these sessions, and look forward to being part of this publication. I'm sorry it hasn't worked live. Always a little complicated in these COVID times, but I'm hoping that this video will be successful, and that delivery model that has been envisaged with all of us recording videos will work smoothly, and that you will have an enjoyable morning session. I would like, first of all, to talk about the title of my chapter. So I am talking about the integration of universal design for learning in schools and the repercussions that this has for pre-service teacher training, for in-service teacher professional development, and for educational leadership, so school leadership. Let me tell you first a little bit about the context. We are currently in most of sort of global north countries, which is on the only positions I can really discuss in the chapter, the experience that I've had working in the US and mostly Canada, and also looking at some of the colleagues I have in Europe. We have a challenge now. Inclusive policies have been in place for approximately 15 years, and we're not seeing much movement. And in fact, we're actually seeing a bit of a step backwards with many stakeholders, such as teachers, education leaders, communities, actually stressing the challenges that they're having with the implementation of inclusion. To add to this complexity, we now have an emerging change of vision on inclusion. And that really is what universal design for learning is. It's not the traditional views on inclusion. So it doesn't work from the perspective of learner exceptionality, or rather it implies that learner diversity is always present in our classrooms, and therefore that the focus shouldn't be put on that, but should be put more on teaching practices. And I will come back into more detail. But this has created a further challenge. It was already very hard for teachers and leaders to be dealing with inclusion objectives. Now they have to actually navigate this sort of shifting landscape where inclusion is being redefined. And this is obviously creating challenges in terms of leadership, but also in terms of professional development, and to some extent in terms of pre-service teacher training. So that's the aim of the objectives of the book. So first of all, I need to quickly explain what universal design for learning is, and not take for granted that all participants in the sessions will know. It's a model that has been around now for about 30 years, but has been increasingly popular in North America in the last 10 years. And its key characteristics, we only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to spend too long, but the key characteristics would be that it's not focused as other sort of practices and principles have been so far on learner exceptionality. It instead presumes that we have learner diversity in our classrooms without having to even walk into the classroom and actually have evidence of this. That you just presume from the start that you have a high percentage of learner diversity in your classroom. Instead of focusing on remedial interventions that focus on the learner's diagnosis, it focuses on the role of the teacher as a designer. So to try and include as much flexibility as possible in the design, with a real focus on inclusive design, so that there's less and less need for remedial action in the classroom. So less and less need for teacher assistance, for alternate format, for retrofitting, for measures that are correcting the design because it's not inclusive in the first place. And all of this combined puts an onus on the teacher, not the student, and that onus, that new burden, is to design inclusively. And we will see that that gives rise to certain challenges. So my chapter is divided into three sections. I look in turn at pre-service teaching, at professional development for in-service teachers, and at leadership, so repercussions on leadership as well. In terms of pre-service teachers, there are obviously going to be a lot of changes that are brought about by this change of visions in inclusion and this move towards universal design for learning. And this is going to require a willingness from academia to re-examine teacher training. At the moment, there's not an awful lot of content in teacher training on inclusion, and that's been a determined shift, because before 15, 20 years ago in North America, we had segregated sort of schooling for students with disabilities, and what we call mainstream systems for students who are seen as able-bodied. Legislation, depending on the jurisdiction, states or provinces, change, but in the last 15 to 20 years, we have moved all of these students in the mainstream classroom, and we've got rid of this notion of special needs. And as a consequence, we've tried in teacher training to avoid the notion of special needs, with a fear that it might just push teachers back into these sort of preconceived categorization. And this has been successful. But the reverse of the coin is that there is not an awful lot of inclusive teaching or specific training on inclusion that is actually included currently in professional development pre-service teaching training. So we need to see that increase a little bit, and we need to include specifically content on universal design. And currently in Canada, there's probably about 3 or 4 campuses only that actually include universal design for learning in pre-service teaching. It's kind of assumed that teachers will, hear about it in the field, that they'll learn about it through mentoring later on. But really, we need to change that and actually include much more of it in the teacher training itself. Universal design for learning is based as well on the on a theory, which is the social model of disability. And I only have 10 minutes. I'm not going to speak about too much. But social model of disability sort of shifts this notion of disability as being an inherent label, and instead positions it as being an interaction between the individual and their individual embodiment, and the requirements of the environment, which is sometimes very badly designed. So that's what social model is. But it's really, really important for teachers to have a good grasp of the social model of disability before they can grasp UDL. And at the moment, there is, from my general scan, no social model of disability awareness done in pre-service teaching at all across Canada. So we need to see that change. Obviously, UDL pushes teachers to become to embrace their role as designers and inclusive designers, and that, I would argue, is not currently something which teachers candidates are supported to do in pre-service teaching training. So we need to change that as well. It's a role that as teachers we're very reluctant to embrace, so we need support in embracing that. And we need, maybe I would argue, a bit less focus on classroom management, which is very much the priority at the moment when we look at the training that teachers are receiving in pre-service training. When it comes to professional development, again, I would bring up the social model of disability. Often by this stage, we are seeing teachers who are, well used to their environments, and they are entrenched into what we call medical model practices. So IEPs, certain modes of funding, certain practices which actually stigmatize and label the students as being exceptional, having special needs, being different. It's a mindset that's very hard to move at. So professional development will really need to focus on that in moving teachers away from that entrenchment in medical model practices. Again, social model of disability awareness will need to be included. And again, teachers at mid-career point, when they're in service and looking at professional development, often are really, really reluctant to embrace their role as a classroom designer. If I find often in master's classes, they will actually argue that they do not have the freedom to design things in a different way, that they're really teaching to do curriculum. So a lot of focus needs to be done in this professional development to free them from this perception and make them realize the full potential they have as designers that can design in an inclusive way, or can design in a way that disables students. Another issue, a quick issue to point out, is that professional development currently in its North American model is far too short. So even when we're seeing a UDL being introduced, it's often introduced in an almost anecdotal way with no follow-up sessions. And really, because it's such a large mind shift, what really would need to see, and this is feedback which I'm certainly getting from study, that we need to see and teachers actually have several follow-up sessions, so they don't just have an introduction to the social model and to UDL and to the principles of UDL, but that they actually dribble down into opportunities to actually see this explained in practice. Now, when it comes to leadership itself, we obviously in this movement trying to move teachers from one school culture to another, a school culture which is very focused on medical model, into a school culture that's looking more at social model practices. It's a huge shift. So shifting school cultures, as we know, is very difficult. I would argue that behind that is a shift in terms of hidden curriculum, that often these practices are embedded in the hidden curriculum, and that we need to actively move these schools to a hidden curriculum that actually actively promotes the values of inclusion that we are looking for. Transformational leadership obviously is going to have a huge impact in a shift around school culture, such an embedded and deep shift in school culture. So it opens up a whole reflection around the use of transformational leadership in schools. Obviously, another repercussions that we need to have school leaders have a better ownership over UDL. At times, it still feels very much as though it's not their tool, it's someone else's. They will need to actually gain ownership over the principle before they can actually dribble this down in their school cultures. Another impact, very quickly, I'm running out of time, but it's also to ensure that school leaders are focusing on social networks and their capacity to actually tap into communities of practice. Often we see leaders feel that they have to reinvent the wheel as far as UDL implementation is concerned, because they work in such silos and they're isolated from other principles. There's a lot of work being done around the world around UDL in schools. So often these days for teachers, it's not so much a question of reinventing a leadership style that supports this, but more about tapping effectively into communities of practice where they can meet and exchange with other leaders who've already gone through this work and actually have the toolbox to actually enable this in a very short time scale. I'm running out of time. I'm already 1 minute over, but I just want to highlight in terms of outcome, this is obviously a huge challenge. Inclusion has been a huge challenge so far, but I would argue that the biggest challenge is yet to come in this sort of shift of culture towards universal design. It is important for leaders to realize that behind the values, pedagogical values, which I've mentioned, there's also a huge cost element and a huge sustainability element. Universal design for learning in the long term is much more cost effective. Retrofitting and medical model practices have been shown to be extremely expensive for our educational institutions. So obviously, it's another argument for leaders to sort of move in a pressing way on these changes, because it is shown to be the only cost-effective and sustainable way of actually implementing inclusion. So the faster we do this, and the more cost-effective management is going to be. Again, I would stress, just to finish, and I've gone to 12 minutes, I apologize for that, that this movement and the shift to UDL has never been more important than it is now in these COVID times. We are seeing shifts to online teaching that do not take into account our diverse learners and inclusion. So UDL will be very important to consider in the current climate that we have in 2020. So this chapter could not be more timely. I thank you very much for listening to the video and taking part in this workshop from the Bahrain Teachers College, and I look forward to be part of the publication. Have a very good morning.